If you're watching this on the Legacy of Survival channel, make sure you're subscribed right now, because today's topic taps into something most people overlook. Everyone talks about military tactics, bushcraft hacks and gear lists, but rarely do we talk about the everyday civilian skills, ordinary people, not soldiers, that made the difference between life and death during some of history's most devastating collapses. These weren't theories. They were learned through war, famine, blackouts, depressions, and sieges. Skills refined by people who didn't have the luxury of modern convenience, yet still kept their families alive while entire systems crumbled around them. So let's get into these 8 lost civilian disaster skills that outsmart modern collapse. The ones history buffs should know, and the ones survivalists should never ignore. How civilians quietly mastered the art of decentralized food resilience. Long before grocery stores created predictable food flow, households built micro-food systems that didn't collapse when the larger networks did. Civilians in the 1930s Dust Bowl, the London Blitz, and post-war Eastern Europe sustained themselves by diversifying small-scale production instead of relying on a single food source. They grew hardy foods in small patches, kept rabbits or pigeons in tiny backyard lofts, and bartered surplus. The principle is simple: reduce points of failure. Today, anyone can apply this by setting up 3 layers. First, grow at least one reliable calorie crop, such as potatoes or cassava. Second, keep a protein source that doesn't require much space, such as quail. Third, build a barter network with neighbours who grow or produce something different. It doesn't need to be large, just consistent, because history shows that collapse rarely takes down every small system at once. How civilians used low-tech preservation to outlast spoiled supplies. Before refrigeration was widespread, people relied on preservation methods that didn't depend on electricity or advanced equipment. Fermentation, salt curing, ash storage, cellar cooling and fat sealing, like confit, weren't trendy homestead projects. They were essential survival habits. In post-war Korea, families preserved vegetables in earthen jars buried partially underground, creating natural temperature regulation. Anyone today can do something similar with a simple buried container, a clay pot, or even a shaded corner of a home that stays cooler year-round. The practical step is to practice preserving at least 2 foods you eat often, so the method becomes second nature. These skills don't go obsolete. The grid does. How families mastered blackout-proof communication systems. When communications failed during the 1977 New York blackout, the Sarajevo siege, or countless wartime blackouts, civilians fell back on predetermined meeting locations and timed check-ins. No radios, no phones. The system worked because it relied on human consistency. Every family had one primary point and one backup point, along with times of day to check each. This is still one of the most effective low-tech communication plans during any collapse. To apply it today, establish a main meet spot within walking distance and a second one further out. Then set intervals such as sunrise, noon or dusk for regrouping. It eliminates guesswork when digital systems fail. So let's talk about how ordinary households practiced quiet resource rationing. You know, without panic. Most people, when they hear the word rationing, they think it's just harsh restriction. But historically, civilians actually treated it more like resource pacing. For example, during the siege of Leningrad, families would create these rotation calendars for everything: fuel, food, textiles, way before any official ration cards were handed out. The strategy was as much psychological as it was practical: ration early while you still have plenty. The modern take on this, really, is to track your usage for a week, then just cut it by 20% without changing your quality of life. You'll uncover waste pretty quickly, and more importantly, you'll build the discipline that saves households long before desperation ever sets in. Now, let's look at how civilians built hyper-local intelligence networks to stay ahead of danger. People surviving under occupation, curfews, or, say, unstable governments, learn to read these subtle community signals, like a delivery truck appearing on the wrong street, or a sudden quietness in a normally busy area, or even shifts in market prices. Civilians relied on these micro-patterns to anticipate trouble before it hit. Today, you can cultivate this skill by paying close attention to local movement, price trends, utility behavior, and, community moods. Just keep a simple log. Within a month, you'll start to recognize patterns that alert you faster than the news cycle ever could. So, let's talk about how households manage to keep their equipment running through what you might call improvisational repair culture. You see, many collapses didn't actually kill people through violence. They killed through the slow breakdown of tools that nobody could replace. Civilians in post-war Italy, or during the 1970s energy crisis, they really stretched the life of every object by making constant small repairs. They fixed things instead of just tossing them out and replacing them. The method's actually pretty straightforward. You put together a repair box with wire, cordage, epoxy, spare screws, and bits of scrap metal. Then you spend a bit of time each month repairing just one worn item in your home. Doing this, it sort of rewires your thinking from always consuming to actually maintaining. This is the mindset civilians always relied on when supply chains just stopped working. Now, let's look at how civilians trained themselves to get around without maps or any signals. During blackouts and evacuations, folks often had to navigate by landmarks, cardinal directions, and natural cues. And this wasn't about wilderness navigation. It was about getting around cities with no lights or street signs. So, one practical step is to walk your neighborhood using only 3 reference points. Maybe a distant building, the direction of the prevailing wind, and the natural elevation of the land. Because when collapse strips away all the signs, well, landmarks become your map. Here's something else: how communities actually survived when there weren't any authorities around small-scale mutual aid. A lot of people think surviving a disaster is all about going it alone, but history really shows the opposite. During the 1980s Polish crisis, the London Blitz, and during all sorts of financial crashes, tight-knit civilian groups shared childcare, pooled tools, took turns cooking, and protected each other's property. And you didn't need a huge group. Even just 3 households were enough. If you want to try this today, just identify 2 neighbours you trust and set one shared task each month, like water storage or keeping tools in good shape. Mutual aid doesn't start when everything falls apart. It's built long before. So, these 8 forgotten civilian disaster skills, they're not just theories or some kind of romanticized old-world charm. They're proven survival systems, crafted by people who lived without any guarantees. If you found this guide valuable, do consider subscribing to Legacy of Survival and share this video so that more folks can learn the lessons history refuses to teach twice.